All right, we should be live now. Let me just check on my phone if it's actually showing on YouTube. I think we're ready to go.
Okay, well, welcome back to Inclusive Design 24. We're joined now by Luis Garcia, who has possibly one of the best talk titles of the whole 24 hours in accessibility testing, or how I learned to stop worrying and ignore WCAG. Luis is a senior product manager for accessibility at eBay. He's also someone that's really active in the accessibility camp scene in the United States, and is pretty much getting amongst accessibility in side projects and a whole bunch of other things. So we're in really good hands for this upcoming talk. And on that note, Luis, if you're ready, it's over to you.
I am ready. Thanks, Leanne, for that great introduction. Hey, everybody. So how's it going? I'm Luis Garcia. As she said, I work at eBay over in California. And today, we're going to be talking about accessibility testing, or how I learned to stop worrying and ignore WCAG. So if you need the slide deck, the URL is here. So it's garcialo.com/2016/ID24/exceptions. Because really this is kind of a talk about exceptions to WCAG and times where WCAG doesn't really apply. And then there's information here on my slide deck on the front page saying, you can follow me at GarciaLO on Twitter. And just a little thing that, I founded the A11Y ATX meetup in Austin, Texas while I was over there. So if you're in the Austin, Texas area, or you're going to be visiting the Austin, Texas area at some point, take a look at their meetup, hang out, go to it, or attend it if you're in Austin. All right, so this is kind of what we're going to be going over today. We're going to be looking at these success criteria and times where WCAG doesn't necessarily apply to that. And a lot of the times it's really WCAG itself that is telling you to ignore WCAG. So we're ignoring WCAG, but we're also still at the same time following WCAG. And some of the situations are going to be places where just it doesn't apply, or WCAG just doesn't apply because it sets some specific criteria that must be met in order for it to apply. So those are little, technically not exceptions, I guess, but they're exception-y. They're interesting, and I thought I'd call them out. So this is what we're going to be talking about, the exceptions to WCAG success criteria. We're including all levels, so we're not excluding AAA, so it's going to be A, AA, AAA. Go through it in order, sorted by level, then success criteria. If it kind of makes sense to group them up, either because the criteria are very similar, from A to AA, AA to AAA, or A to AAA, then we'll do that. And then for each of the exception, each of the success criteria, give a brief summary of each, just in case there's people that aren't familiar with it. Or some of the success criteria we're going to be talking about are not often really considered, right? They're not the hot, sexy ones that everybody always talks about, like alt text and contrast stuff, right? So we're going to talk about things that are a little bit sometimes overlooked. I'll go over any necessary key terms that are either needed for understanding the exception, or maybe for understanding how the criteria applies, or understanding the criteria itself. And then we're going to look at the exceptions to the criteria, maybe talk about why it's an exception, and then provide some examples if we need to. And then, I've done this one in discussion before, so if you have any questions, I guess kind of wait to the end, or you can, see if you can get the questions asked beforehand, and they can kind of, Leonie or Hans can just kind of butt in, and I can kind of have a little bit of discussion that way. I don't mind. All right, so let's go on to our first one. This one isn't really, honestly, the best example of an exception, but it comes first at the beginning, right? So it's 111 non-text content. It's a single A. And to kind of summarize what it is, right? It's basically the text alternative success criteria. So basically, text is easy for assistive technology to process. And for non-text content that's useful, you need to provide a text version of that content. And that text version needs to serve the same purpose as that content. So some key terms in non-text content is text, right? So what exactly is text? So it's representations of human language. What is a text alternative? A text alternative is text that's programmatically associated with the non-text content, or it's referred to by text that is programmatically associated with the non-text content. There's also this term which is name, and that one, it's a text that a program can use to identify a component, can be hidden. So usually that's going to be things like so checkboxes and other inputs, text inputs. Those have names, so it's technically not like a text alternative. They have a name. Pure decoration. That term means that something is only for aesthetic purposes. It presents no information, it has no function. And then the last term we have is specific sensory experience. It's very similar to pure decoration in that there is no information being presented, and it has no function, or in that it's only for, it's similar in that it serves no important function, and there's no important information being presented, but it's not purely for decoration. So it's similar to pure decoration, it's just there's some value to it other than just decorative. All right, so the exceptions for non-text content are these, like I said, less exceptions and more just slight variations of alternative text. So for example, controls and inputs, they should have names instead, right? So that's, we kind of brought up the term, so we can kind of explain that. So controls and inputs, they don't get a text alternative, they have a name. Time-based media, those technically don't have text alternatives, but they don't have alt text, right? So the text alternative for them doesn't need to serve an equivalent purpose. It just needs to provide a descriptive identification of the media, and then it pawns you off to all the media-related success criteria to get some additional information. So it just kind of like, it says the text alternative needs to kind of identify it, and then go look at, we have a whole bunch of other success criteria that's specifically for time-based media. So take a look at those, and we will take a look at those. So first one that's actually kind of an exception is a test. So if you have alt text, if something you would provide alt text for would invalidate the purpose of the test, then the text alternative should describe the purpose instead of being like an exact equivalent of what you're representing, right? So we're going to go into examples after we kind of go through these exceptions, and we'll see some of that. Sensory. So if the content creates a specific sensory experience, then your alt text needs to provide a descriptive identification of that content. A CAPTCHA. So alt text must say that it's a CAPTCHA, and then alternative CAPTCHAs for different senses must be provided. So it's like you're not going to have an exact text alternative for it. You just need to have an alternative CAPTCHA for different senses. Decoration, formatting, and invisible. So that's also exceptions for non-text content. So if you have something that is purely decorative, or it's used for visual formatting, or it's not presented to the users, so it's hidden, then it must be ignored by assistive technology. And that's the alt equals quote quote thing that everybody knows about. All right, so here's some examples. Yes. Yes.
I just wanted to make sure that you're aware that you're still sharing your webcam and not your screen. So that's your intention.
I should be sharing my screen. I can see my screen. I don't see my webcam.
No, but we do.
All right. Well, apologies for that. So screen share. Screen share. All right. Entire screen. Sorry. All right. So now, whoa. All right. So now we can see my screen.
Yep.
All right. Sorry about that. All right. Cool. So here's some examples. So luckily, all the content I'm providing is text-based. So there's not any images or anything. So same experience for our sighted users and our non-sighted users. So we're good. All right. So some examples of some of these exceptions. So for sensory tests, so if you have like a hearing exam or an eye exam, something like that, those would be exempt something that's testing those senses, those would be exempt because they're sensory experiences. A spelling test would be negated completely if you had an alt text for the word that the user needs to spell. So that's going to be exempt because it's it's an exempt because it's a test. A symphony performance, a flute solo, visual art. Those are things that create specific sensory experiences and are therefore kind of exempt from that criteria. All right. So next we're going to be looking at the media success criteria, the media alternative exception. So there are 3 success criteria: 121, audio only and video only; 122, captions, pre-recorded; and 123, audio description or media alternative, which each have the exception that we're going to be discussing today. So each of those success criteria basically say it's like the text alternative success criteria, except it applies to audio, video, media. So any information portrayed in that media needs to be presented in another way. That's what the success criteria say. And so the exception to that is, well, if the media that you have is an alternative, then it is exempt from needing its own alternative, right? So if you have an accommodation, you don't need to have an accommodation for your accommodation, because otherwise you'll just end up in this infinite regression of needing alternatives for your alternatives for your alternatives, needing accommodations for your accommodations for your accommodations. So examples, right? You have a transcript, that's an alternative, that's an accommodation that's made. Captions, video of somebody signing, or you have an audio description. You don't need to provide any kind of alternative to those. All right. So the next one we'll be looking at is use of color. This is kind of one of my least favorite exceptions, and we'll get to that in a second. So the summary of 141, use of color, is don't use color alone to tell the difference between 2 things, right? So just don't use color alone. Everybody knows that. However, one of the techniques under 141, technique G183, allows the removal of the visual indicator for links, for link text, right? In certain criteria, right? So if we have a link that's in a sentence, and you can usually tell that it's a link because it's underlined. Now, a lot of designers like to remove that visual indicator, the visual indication that it's a link. And so normally that would fail because there's no differentiation between the text and the surrounding text. So let me go ahead and scroll down just a second so that the sighted folk can see this example. And I have a sentence that says, somewhere in the sentence is a link that fails 1.4.1. And so there's no differentiation other than the color, and it's a very slight color change, but it's there, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it's totally in there. There's a slight color change on the word sentence. So it's a bad color choice, but the color is used nonetheless, and so the only thing differentiating it is color. So the guideline says don't use color alone. Color alone is being used. Now, it does have an indicator if we hover over it. So we're kind of halfway to meeting technique G183. Technique G183 says that this will pass if it has a visual indicator on focus, which this does, and then the contrast with the surrounding text is at least 3:1. This one doesn't, right, because it's a very low contrast and doesn't meet 3:1. Now, we could pass that by just making it a little bit brighter. And so here's an example of text that passes. So it says somewhere in the sentence is a link that passes 1.4.1. And I give this example because this is part of why the reason I don't really like this guideline, because I personally don't think it's really sufficient to just have the color be different. I really want there to be a visual indicator. And the color that I've chosen is kind of a dark purple. So for the sighted folk, it should look, unless you have like way better eyesight than I do, like I can't really tell the difference between the word sentence, the purple that's in here, and the dark and the black that's surrounding it. But it does have a 3:1 contrast ratio exactly between the text in sentence and then the text surrounding it. And as a bonus, it actually has a 7:1 ratio with the background, which is white. So it meets, the highest contrast requirement or highest contrast minimum, and it also meets the contrast minimum for the surrounding text. So that passes. All right. So now let's talk about audio control. So 142, audio control, level A. So the summary of audio control is if you have something, if you have audio media on your page that starts automatically, then you need to provide a pause stop button or a volume control for the audio. Usually that's kind of summarized as that, right? If you have audio, you need to have a pause stop button or a volume control. Well, this is kind of one of those ones where not really so much like an exception, but it's like it only applies in certain cases. So it applies when the audio starts automatically and where it lasts longer than 3 seconds. So examples of exceptions would be audio that lasts exactly 3 seconds, audio that is less than 3 seconds, or audio that doesn't play automatically. Okay, so we're flying through these. Hopefully we should have plenty of time for questions at the end, or any kind of discussion. All right, so the next criteria is 2.1.1 keyboard. It's level A. So to summarize keyboard, right, so the keyboard success criteria says that all actions on a page can be done with a keyboard. Another way is anything that can be done with a mouse can also be done with a keyboard. So, so that way you have users that can't use a mouse, they should be able to do everything with a keyboard. So the exception for keyboard is situations where the action that the user is performing depends on more than just the endpoints. So it's like, well, what does that mean? So if you have something, so some examples of it are like brush strokes in a painting program, right? So that's kind of essential to the action that's being performed. Is that if you have a keyboard, you can't really do brush strokes. You can only kind of you could create a square using like a square creation tool. You could create a circle using a circle tool and just say like, well, I'm gonna have a circle, but these are going to kind of be the dimensions. You can size it up. You could even do like kind of complex, like curves and stuff, because they're the tools that allow you to create more complex shapes just using the keyboard. And those are totally acceptable. Those totally fall under 2.1.1 keyboard because they don't require specific motion with the hands or specific trails to be traced. So the examples are brushstrokes in a painting program. Another example is a flight training simulator, specifically the one that WCAG provides. The specific example that's listed in WCAG is a model helicopter flight training simulator. But it would apply the same for any kind of flight simulator, or really kind of any kind of training simulator where you have a specific, you kind of have a specific, interface that you need to use in order to properly train to use the real thing. And so it doesn't really make any sense that there'd be like a keyboard alternative. Like, yeah, you could probably go and design a keyboard interface specifically to do that, but that's a whole other thing. All right, so the next criteria is pause stop hut. It's a 2.2.2 pause stop hut, level A. And this is one of the ones where it's not much an exception, but it's like it only applies in certain situations. So 2.2.2 is a little complicated. So there's two sections of it. The first one applies to content that's moving, blinking, or scrolling. And then the second section talks about, it applies to content that is auto-updating. For content that's moving, blinking, or scrolling, then 4 criteria need to be met in order for the success criteria to apply. So first, the moving, blinking, or scrolling content needs to start automatically. Second, it needs to last longer than 5 seconds. Third, it needs to be presented alongside other content. And then fourth, the content needs to be not essential to the underlying activity. For auto-updating content, same thing. It needs to start automatically, so it's very similar to the other one. It needs to be presented alongside other content, also similar to the moving, blinking, or scrolling. And it's not essential to the activity, also very simple or very similar to moving, blinking, and scrolling. The only difference is the lasting longer than 5 seconds, because if it's auto-updating, it it can last forever, right? So that doesn't really mean anything. So the key terms that we kind of want to talk about is just blinking. Like, what does that mean technically? It just means switching back and forth between two visual states to draw attention to something, right? That's what blinking is. Moving would probably be something similar to any kind of like animation on the screen. Maybe something bouncing around. Like a down arrow saying, oh, hey, there's more content. If you scroll down, it just kind of like bounces around. Scrolling content would probably be something like a marquee, or maybe like a stock ticker, things like that. Just kind of anything that kind of goes through, or maybe the page kind of auto scrolls for some reason, or they're scrolling on the page. Yeah, automatic scrolling. And then auto updating. Everybody knows auto updating content is like, say, you have Twitter, you have Facebook. The content's just kind of like always going, or maybe like a scoreboard that's keeping track of the game, and so the numbers update, etc. Or like a stock ticker, right? Well, that's a little bit more scrolling than auto updating, but you could have, you can imagine like a table stock ticker, where you have like a few stocks that you're following, and the values update dynamically in the table. So for pause, stop, hide, it's just like any other situation, just like the audio control, where if the situation that you have doesn't meet every single one of the requirements, then the guideline doesn't apply. So for examples, if you have an advertisement that lasts 5 seconds exactly, or less than 5 seconds, then it's exempt from the guideline because it doesn't last longer than 5 seconds, so it doesn't apply. If you have a 15-second full-page ad, well, it's longer than 5 seconds, but the advertisement takes up the entire page. It obfuscates, the main content of the page, so you can't really, do anything on it. It's basically inactive. The only content you can interact with is the advertisement. So it's the only content presented on the page, so it's fine. It's exempt from the check. A loading animation as the only thing on a page, same kind of thing. It's the only thing on the page. It's not really like you're being prevented from doing anything else. Well, I guess you are being prevented from doing anything else, but there's not other content on there where a person with a disability would specifically kind of be a barrier created specifically for them. And we're going to see something similar to that in a second as well. All right, so the next one is link purpose exception. So there are two guidelines that are link purpose. The first one is 2.4.4, link purpose in context. It's level A. And the second one is 2.4.9, link purpose link only, which is AAA. So to kind of summarize both of them, 2.4.4 says users can tell where a link goes based on the link text and its context. So the context with where the link is in and the link itself. And then for 2.4.9, it's basically the same thing, but the only thing that's considered is the link text alone. So it's users can tell where a link goes based on the link text alone. And we'll just talk for a second about things that can provide context, so we can kind of have an idea of like the difference between 2.4.4 and 2.4.9. So the immediate heading for a link can provide context. So if we have, so we could have like a read more link or a click here link if the context with the link text, well, that's not a good example for the click here. The read more makes a little more sense. So we could have like a paragraph of information and have a heading above it that's like a book name or something, and then a description of the link, a short description of the book, and then the text read more. Well, the immediate heading for that link is like the book title or something. So that's sufficient context being provided for that for it to pass 2.4.4 or for 2.4.4 to be satisfied. Words in the same sentence. So technically, right, you could have a click here for this action, something or other, in the same sentence. It's not best practice. We don't recommend it. Nobody recommends it. But technically, it can get context from that and be fine. Maybe some people disagree and you want to start a discussion. That's great. Fine. I don't mind. You can yell at me. But I'm going to say that gives it context. And if you have the right wording in there, it should be fine. Words in the same paragraph, same kind of thing, right? So it's just kind of like, it's a sentence is like a single p tag with one period, and then a paragraph is a one p tag with several periods in it, right? With sentences in it. Basically the same thing. Words in the same list item, very similar to the previous ones. So list items are kind of similar or analogous to words in the same sentence. Words in previous list item in a list of similar items. So the example presented in WCAG for this situation is like if you have a download links. So you have like, oh, download this map, or download this document in HTML format. And then, well, if that's the first item in a list, you could have other items in the list, which is like, instead of saying download this content in HTML format, or download this in PDF format, or download this in Word document format, you could just have just PDF, just Word, just Excel, or just whatever. As long as the first one's described, it can kind of provide context for the other list items in the same list if they're all related. And then the last thing is kind of explicitly providing some context using attributes such as the title attribute, aria label, aria labeled by, or aria described by. So those are actions you need to take, but you can also provide context for links in that way, and those would satisfy 244. 249 is basically saying 249 is basically only looking at the link text and not considering any of this other context. And then so here are some key terms in link purpose for context. Actually, this applies to the exception, so we'll kind of talk about the exception. The exception for link purpose for both of them, for both 244 and 249, is if no one would know where the link goes without going to it. So the example sentence I have here is, one of the notable exports is guava, and the link is on the word guava. So this could pretty much go anywhere, and this so we'll go back to our key term, which is ambiguous to users in general, and that's since no one would know where it goes without going to it, it's ambiguous to everybody. So it's there's nothing because of somebody's disability that would kind of put them out, that would barriers created because of disability, right? Everybody is equally put out. So it's like let's see. So if you had like a rickety old bridge that like if anybody stepped on it, they would fall through it and die in a ravine, right? It's not an accessibility issue at that point, because like a fully bodied person would walk on it and fall and die to fall to their deaths. Somebody in a wheelchair would walk on it and fall to their deaths. It's equally accessible, right? So it's not an accessibility issue at that point. Usually these are going to be things that are like more like UX issues or design issues. They're just bad for everybody, and it's like they really should be fixed, but they're not specifically accessibility issues, right? It's the same thing with the word guava in the sentence. One of the notable exports is guava. Doing good on time. All right, so the next criteria is parsing. So 4.1.1, parsing, level A. So basically, parsing is the code specification success criteria. And kind of more explicitly, it says code the specifications and follow the rules in the following list. Those 4 rules are use start and end tags, nest your elements properly, don't use duplicate attributes, and use unique ID attributes. Right. So HTML tags usually have start tags and end tags. In previous iterations of other HTML specs, or like XHTML specs, it's like, well, you need to explicitly always have your start tags and your end tags. So here it says use start tags, use both starting and end tags. Nesting elements properly, right? It just makes sense that when we have certain constructs that they need to fit in a certain way, and so if everybody does them in the same way, then that'll work for everybody. The AT vendors and any kind of programs that are made specifically for understanding HTML will know what to expect from the constructs that are created if everything is nested properly according to the specification. Not using duplicate attributes. That's basically just don't put 2 of the same attribute in the same element, because otherwise some programs might interpret the first one as being the authoritative one. Some programs might interpret the second one as being the authoritative one. So don't use duplicates, because you don't know how the person that wrote the program that interprets HTML will consider that decision. So just don't use duplicate attributes. And then unique ID attributes, pretty much just the whole point of an ID is to be a unique identifier. So if you have 2 things that have the same unique identifier, then it's not really an ID at that point. It's something else, but it's not an ID. So parsing says code to specification and make sure you do all this stuff. Now the exception to parsing is same kind of thing with the exceptions where the rule is the exception is the rule itself telling us to ignore the rule in these cases. And so our exception to parsing is that you can ignore the rules if the specification says you can ignore the rules. So the example I present is that not using end tags for image elements, paragraph elements, list items, and other elements where it's either required by the spec or allowed by the spec to omit it. Right. So for example, the image element the image element should not have an end tag. It only has the opening tag. And then paragraph and list item, it's kind of common practice to close them, but it's not required by the spec. And in the code that I make, I don't close my p tags and list item tags unless I need to. Most of the time, they don't really need to be closed, so don't close them. And it's totally valid, and it totally passes 4.141. No big deal. Oh, and a note, side note, the HTML spec pages for each of the elements, so every element has its own page. In the examples I provided above, there are links to the exact element pages for these, right? So they kind of look like this, and each element's page has a section called tag omission, where it kind of specifically says if it's required or not for it to be omitted, or if it's allowed for the end tag to be omitted. So it's a nifty little thing to know. All right, so the next one we're going to look at is contrast exception. So there's two success criteria that apply to contrast. And this is the contrast of text, including text in images, and its background need to meet a certain contrast ratio. Right, so the text on a certain background needs to be a certain contrast rate, a minimum contrast ratio that needs to be met. Now, so two of the key terms that we have for this are contrast ratio and large scale text, because one of the exceptions is larger text can have a lower contrast ratio. But what exactly is larger text, and what exactly is a contrast ratio? Well, contrast ratio is kind of like complicated color theory stuff. I really don't understand completely what it is. I've read it several times, and I understand it while I'm reading it, but I just don't really retain that information. It's not my area of expertise. So I just use a tool to calculate it, right? Because we have all these tools that do a good job of doing that. We have ones that will do it automatically for text. It's in the pages, and we have the color contrast analyzer, which is a TPG tool, and that will let you do manual testing of two colors that are on a page or in an image of text, or in images of text, things like that. And then the second term we have is large scale text. That's another one where it's like, this is like complicated font designy stuff using terminology that I'm just not familiar with. It's not my area of expertise. And some of the tools that are available for checking contrast automatically will make the determination, do the calculations to see whether or not text on a page is normal text or if it's large text, right? So, so the tools that will do that are like Axe by Q, or the Google Accessibility Developer tools. Those will both consider the size of the text itself when determining whether to apply the contrast ratio minimum for normal text or for large text. The tools will do it for you. Don't sweat it. Don't feel like you need to know every single little bit of the color theory stuff or the weird font, calculation stuff. In some situations, you need to learn it just to apply it, and that makes sense in some cases. But most of the time, you're not really going to need to do that. All right. So the exceptions that we have for contrast is the first one I've already mentioned, is large text, right? So if you have a large text, it's easier to see. And so the contrast ratio between the text and its background doesn't need to be as high, right? Because it's larger text, easier to see. Incidental text also doesn't really need to have, that one's exempt from needing a contrast ratio, because those are going to be, or meeting the contrast ratio minimum. So things like interactive, so those are going to be like inactive interactive control text, decorative element text, invisible element text, text in images where the text isn't important, and then of course anything that isn't text will be exempt because the the success criteria only applies to text and its background. Logo types are also exempt. So they're explicitly called out. So logos and brand names. For brand names, that gets a little sketchy. I'll kind of talk about that in a second. So here are some examples that are exempt from contrast. So random words used to create a background and not for their meaning, right? So if you have like decorative words, kind of like in a word cloud, or maybe they're arranged in some kind of like shape or something, they're not there to be the content of the words themselves. They're really just there to, for decoration and to create this background. So those are exempt from contrast ratio. Somebody's name that's on a name tag in a photograph, that's incidental text, right? It's not really important. In most cases, it's not going to be important content on the page. I can think of some cases where it might be important, but most of the time it's not going to be important. It's going to be incidental. So that doesn't need to have, that text on that person's, in the picture of a person, it's not really going to need to meet the success criteria. If you have an inactive link, input, or control, those don't need to meet the criteria, or meet the minimum. So those are going to be like, grayed out inputs or controls, so when they're inactive or, basically when they're inactive, you can't use them. They're going to be grayed out. Same thing with like a previous link in pagination, right? So if you have the link that says previous, and you have the numbers 1, 2, 3, and then you have the word next, right? They're all links. If you're on the first page and there's no previous page, the word previous, the link previous can be grayed out. If you're on the third page and there's no next page, right? The word next, the link next can be grayed out as well. Or have just like a really poor contrast because it's inactive. It doesn't go anywhere. If it was a link and actually kind of went somewhere, then it would need to have a good contrast because it's active at that point. But when it's useless, when it's inactive, it doesn't need to have the contrast minimum. And then finally, we have logos, right? So for a business or a product. So the logos, right, that's kind of tied to branding and stuff. But logos specifically, those can be, text in logos does not need to meet the contrast minimums because, it's just, they're exempt. It's essential that they have, this is essential to their brand and the message that they're conveying. However, so for instance, like eBay, we have it's EBAY, and they're all different colors. It's like red, blue, green, yellow, or something like that. So, or yellow, green, whatever. Somebody could maybe say, not saying that anybody has said this specifically, I'm just saying that somebody could say like, oh, well, these specific colors that are in our logo are part of our brand. So, hey, let's use these colors everywhere. And since they're part of our brand, they're exempt. Like, well, no, because just because the colors are part of the brand and part of the logo doesn't mean that anything using those colors is exempt. Only when you're using it like as a brand name. So if we had maybe like eBay brand shoes and we had like the eBay Totally Extreme shoes, or we had like sold trucks and we're like the eBay Totally Extreme truck, and Totally Extreme like had some kind of like stylized, kind of had its own little like stylized logo or stylized branding to the text, then it would be exempt. But in all other cases, it's not going to be. So logos are exempt. Things that are kind of like branding logos, that kind of text, that's also going to be exempt. All right, we're getting to resize text. Excuse me. Okay, so resize text. Summary. Text can be resized up to 200% without loss of content. So basically, if most of the time when people test this, they'll just kind of like zoom the page in 200% and make sure that none of the content is like spilling over itself, or that there aren't any of the controls that like fall off the page or become inaccessible because of the size increase. Technically, this applies to only text resizing, so it's not really saying the zoom in a browser usually zooms everything, but technically this applies only to text resizing. I don't really make that huge of a differentiation between those, and I know of some interpretations of the success criteria where they say that you really can't fail this unless you've like completely disabled the ability for the user to zoom. So like other than that, is like it would pass in all those situations. So exceptions to resizing text would be situations kind of similar to the media exception that we had. So we have captions. Those are exempt from needing to be resized. It's always best practice to if you have the option, you can resize the captions, great, but you don't need to. And images of text, right? So it's kind of functionally impossible, right? So if we have like a person's name on their name tag in a photograph, there's just no way of resizing only that text in the image without like resizing the entire thing. And then we have open captions for a video. It's the same kind of thing, right? So one, it's captions, and then two, it's kind of functionally impossible because there are also images of text that are on this video, right? So situations like that are exempt from the needing to be able to resize the text without losing the content. And then kind of similar, we get to the images of text. So the two success criteria that we have for images of text are 1.4.5, images of text, AA, and then 149, images of text with no exceptions, which is AAA. And this one is amusing. So the summary of it is basically use text to show text, and don't use images to show text, right? So use the things that use the constructs that you have to show the text. So key terms that we have is visually customized. So things that can be visually customized, so those texts, you can change the font, the size, the color, and the background of the text, of the text. If you can change all that, then it's visually customized. And then the second one is essential, as in the text. So it's something that would be useless if it wasn't there. That's considered essential. And so the exceptions that we have, specifically for 1.4.4, is if something is customizable, like if the text is customizable, then it's exempt from being an image of text. So it's okay for that text to be an image of text if it can be customized. If you can change the font, change the size, change the color, change the background, then it's exempt. And then another example, another exception is if the text, the image of text is essential, like something wouldn't work because of that, then it's exempt. And for 149, which has no exceptions, if it's essential, then it's exempt. So just like for 144. But then additionally for 149, that's not specified in 1.4, is that if it's a decorative text, then it's exempt from 149, right? So if it's used only for decoration, then it's exempt. Yes?
We're almost at the time, Lewis.
All right, cool. Yeah, I'm like one or two more slides, so just really close. Okay, so here's some examples of images of text. So logos, they have text in them, right? We've already kind of talked about that, and then the branding that goes along with it. Representations of a font family, right? So if you're trying to demonstrate to somebody like, hey, this is what a font family looks like, it doesn't really make any sense for you to kind of just display it as text, right? You kind of need to have an image of text of that to represent it. If you have a historical letter or document, and you're representing that, it's more than just the content of the text in the document or in the letter. It's really like, how is the document aged? What kind of maybe somebody spilled something on it. Like maybe somebody signed it in a special way, and that's a very important part of the document. Those are exempt from images of text. Or if the font's not widely available, and you want to have like a call to action or something like that, something that needs to be in a specific font, then you can have an image of text for that. If you have customizable image text, right? So that's only for 144. So if you have something maybe like an SVG, where you have an image of text, but you can customize it, meeting all those criteria, then that's going to be exempt from the criteria of using text for text. And then dynamically generated images, very similar to like the SVG. Basically, you can modify it and do everything that you can with regular text, so that's fine. And we'll just very quickly kind of fly through multiple ways. And I think it's no interruptions next. Ooh, language parts. Oh, geez, there's so much stuff to go. All right, we're going to fly through these. So multiple ways basically says you need to have at least 2 ways of finding a page within a set of pages. The acceptable ways are search, links to all pages on a home page, links to all pages on all pages, a table of contents, and a sitemap. So in order to pass or meet the success criteria, you need to have at least 2 of those on your pages. Exceptions to the multiple ways success criteria are basically processes. So if you have a checkout system, right? So you purchase something, you need to select your payment method, you need to select where you're going to ship it to, and then you need to do the sign out and the checkout, everything. that's going to be an exception to needing to have two of those ways on your page. Or if you have a process for like sign up and registration, right? You need to provide some information. Maybe you need to provide some background documents. Maybe you need to upload some stuff. You have a process that needs to be followed. Those are going to be exempt from multiple ways. The next one is language of parts, and I think no timing's next. That's the last one. So for language of parts, basically, so there's two success criteria that apply to language. One of them is the language for the whole document, and the second one is language of parts, and that refers to kind of discrete pieces of language that are in the page. So the language of parts guideline basically says mark up uses of languages that aren't the default language. So if you have text within your document that isn't the same as the default, then you need to mark it up as what language it is. So some exceptions to those are if you have a proper name of a person or thing, if you have technical term, right, so jargon that's used in a professional setting, if you have words of an indeterminate language, right, so gibberish or non-human languages, or if you have words or phrases that are associated with the surrounding text, right, so those are going to be like borrowed words from one language to another, or words that kind of like by themselves, have a specific meaning, basically borrowed words, or if it's like part of a phrase. So here are some examples. So Jane Doe, Bigfoot, Nicaragua, those are formal names. Those are proper names of people or things. Homo sapiens, Alpha Centauri, Hertz, habeas corpus. Those are technical terms. Those are jargony words, so you don't need to call those out. Elvish words, right? So that's a made-up language. That's a indeterminate language. So that doesn't need to have any kind of like there's no like language code you could even apply to that, right? So here's some more other examples of like gibberish words. So there's Billy Wallop and Snarful Glade, very important words. And then we have the words or phrases that are associated with surrounding text or kind of like borrowed words, that kind of thing. So we have like rendezvous, taco, and one of the examples from WCAG is the use of the word podcast in a non-English site. Right? So podcast is English. If you have a French site that says something, 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 and that says podcast, they don't need to code up the word podcast as being in English. So there's something after that. And then the last one we have is no timing. So the summary of no timing is that timing interactions are not allowed on the page. So it basically means nothing at all that requires timing, because it's so no timing is a AAA guideline, so it's not often enforced. But some exceptions for no timing are things like non-interactive synchronized media, so like video, like audio, things that don't have user interaction, and then non-interactive real-time events such as like live webcasts or broadcasts, which is misspelled, without user interactions. So, I have another one, interruptions. I forgot about this one. We'll go through this one very quickly as well.
Very quickly.
Yeah, very well. Actually, we can go ahead and stop here because I put all the AAA ones kind of at the end, so that way, if we ran out of time, they're not as important because people.
Well, since they're usually ignored anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Usually ignored. So we don't really need it. Yeah. All right. Well, there we go. Any questions?
Yeah, thanks for your presentation, Louis. We have about 2 minutes, so I'll ask a few quick questions. You mentioned success criteria on 1.4.1, the use of color one, and you gave some examples of the exemption that is provided in the spec where you have sufficient contrast between, for example, link and its running text. If it's, I think it's above 3:1, that's not always really sufficient. Would you feel that success criteria needs to be updated so that that's really not allowed and that you really need like an underline at all times for links surrounding by text?
Yes,
do you think that needs to be more strict?
That's exactly my opinion. I think it needs to be more strict. So every time this issue comes up, I kind of passive-aggressively suggest a recommendation, which is you can either do one of two things. The first thing you can do is you can not remove the default focus indication or visual indication, which is really easy to do. You just don't remove it because you're actively removing it. Or you can do the other thing, which is to, one, make sure that you have the visual indicator on focus, right? 2, make sure that the contrast between the link text and its background is at least 4 to 5. Make sure that the contrast between the surrounding text and the background is at least 4 to 5. And make sure that the contrast between the link text and the surrounding text is at least 3 to 1. So you can do one thing, which is, stop doing something bad, or you can do something else, which is a lot of extra work that you're going to have to do and that designers are going to have to think about to actually pass, to meet all of these criteria that need to be met.
And also, I don't think it's theoretically possible to have both the link and the text have sufficient background contrast to each other and their background.
Exactly. In a lot of cases, it's very difficult to do. Yeah, but it's not impossible, right? Like I'm doing it here, and it's just like one example I came up with. I'm sure that you could come up with others, but they're not going to fall as easily all the time to meeting those criteria.
About success criterion 1.4.4, the Resizing Text one. Probably the most common occurrence that I see of this particular one is that developers of mobile sites disable support for pinch zooming. It's really quite often on responsive sites you'll see that because they really want everything to be positioned absolutely and fitting the screen. What would your way of dealing with that be? Should that be allowed since most devices have like native support for zooming in their accessibility settings, or should it all be filled? And if so, what would the solution be? Because that clearly goes against all the design practices at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, right, so I always strive for best practices, and I don't think that should be disabled, right, because I kind of summarized the guideline, but here's the text of the guideline itself. It says, except for captions, images of text can be resized without assistive technology up to 200%. So the without assistive technology means kind of like just using what you have, like the browser, right? So yes, devices kind of allow that, but that's usually under the accessibility section. I kind of see that as being assistive technology, right? Because like voiceovers under the accessibility section, that's assistive technology. Same thing with that, right? So this is saying without that, it should be able to be zoomed to 200%. So absolutely, if they're disabling the native browser zoom, it's going to fail. And they just you should always allow the user to have the freedom. You're like, oh, well, it's going to look ugly. It's like, well, that's the user's prerogative. If they need it to look ugly a little bit, like in one way that you don't want it to look, just so they can actually use the page, then let them do it.
Yeah, no, we have that policy here as well. My last question about success criterion 4.1.1, parsing. Quite often, if you have a complex page, you'll see like hundreds, if not thousands, of errors on the page related to. I'm sorry, I'm talking about validation errors. If you run it through the validator, a lot of those errors will not be related to accessibility or not have any influence on accessibility or the user in general. But it can be very difficult to find the errors that are relevant and make them to the developer in a way that's meaningful and in what they need to fix. Do you have any approach to dealing with that?
I don't have a specific approach to dealing with that. I mean, basically, because this is one of the criteria that I don't really like failing too much, because of like the weird kind of nebulous stuff around it. It doesn't always necessarily create accessibility issues. The time where it really kind of creates barriers is when you have like an overloading of an ID attribute, and so then you're going to have like two ARIA described bys or two ARIA labeled bys, something like that. Maybe two labels that are pointing to to an ID, but there's two of them, right? Yeah. So it's situations like that where that kind of like really creates it. If you have the things like the start end tags, it's like, well, yeah, if you don't close your heading tag, yeah, that's going to technically be an accessibility issue, but that's going to be found out like in design, because the designer is going to be like, oh, I need to fix this because I screwed up my whole page. Like those are going to be things that are kind of taken care of by themselves. The nesting properly.
The browser will automatically fix it for you. By
exactly, or the browser will fix it. Yeah, exactly. So it's like I don't like calling them because I find them kind of hard to justify. Just because it's like, well, what issue is being created by this? It's like, well, there's not really one, but technically it doesn't pass. Right? Technically, you don't have, you have things other than list items in your list. But the way I kind of like communicate the importance of it is I say, well, look at it this way. Kind of like what I explained when I was, summarizing it, is that if you follow the spec, right, that kind of creates a specific constructs that you're going to be following when you create something, right? So if you have a list, the expectation is that you're going to have the UL, and then it's only going to have list items inside of it. That's the expected construct that's being set up by the spec. That's how people, if you code it that way, then any programs that are going to be consuming your code can know to expect only those items to be only the list items to be listed, to be nested underneath a UL. Right.
I'm gonna have to cut you off, Lewis, because we have to move to the next stream,
course.
and I can only have one stream at a time running.
Yeah, that was pretty much the end of my thought. So
okay.
Thank you all very much for having me, and
thank
you all
you
have a
very
great
much for the
ID24.
presentation.
Sure.
Yeah, it was very interesting, and the next session we'll be listening to Robert Jolly. So see you there.